Welcome to Interior Design's virtual roundtable discussion on designing with purpose, which is a topic with extra relevance today in these complicated times. I am Jen Renzi, executive editor of the magazine, and I'll be moderating the discussion today between our esteemed panelists, Sasha, Kimberly, Jennifer, and also we have Mina sort of joining in a few minutes. Also, a big thank you to those of you who are tuning in on DesignTV. Today we'll be covering pretty broad terrain, including, how do we design today's and tomorrow's commercial spaces so that they're both safe and beautiful. Obviously we're going to touch on health and safety and, what is kind of dominating the discussion. But I feel like we're at this really interesting point where 7 months into the pandemic, a lot of clients I know who were originally thinking of kind of stopgap measures are like, okay, now we have to really design for this sort of new normal, this period that is extending, and really curious to hear, what clients are talking about, what they're investing in, how they're approaching their spaces, and just what you guys are seeing. Also, we'll be talking about how COVID has affected your own practices, your processes, and the products you specify, materials you're interested in. So it's a lot of ground to cover. We don't have oodles of time, so I'd love to start going around the Zoom room and just have everybody introduce themselves, name, affiliation, a project you're working on that's really exciting. Also, I want to begin with a big thank you to 3form, who is our sponsor today. So I'd like to pass the mic to Jen, who will you can begin the introductions, and we'll move around the squares.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, thanks for having us today. As you said, I'm also Jen Ruckel. I'm the Vice President of Sales for 3form. 3form, as most of you know, is one of the leading manufacturers in translucent materials, and we have been having a lot of conversations about division of space. 3form also, supplies acoustic and architectural hardware solutions for A&D, so our clients are specifically those architects and designers trying to solve these problems. We are working on a lot of great projects. I'm sure, like most of you, it feels like a little bit of a start and stop. These projects get going, and then some of them have to pause for obvious reasons, especially if they're trying to bring their workforce back into the office. But in addition to projects, we're also working on a lot of really new innovation in the space of translucent materials, and I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of that as we talk today.
Hi, I'm Sasha Wagner. I'm the president and CEO of Huntsman Architectural Group. We're a firm that focuses on workplace and also landlord services and renovating existing buildings. We have offices in San Francisco, where I'm based, and in New York and Chicago as well. I'm also currently serving as the president for IIDA, and so I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you, Sasha. Kimberly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
We have an office in San Francisco, which is where I'm based, and also LA and Denver. And we're working on a number of weird and wonderful projects, including a lot of workplace, and then also diving into the retail sector and some hospitality, as well as some ground up work.
Great. And Mina, tell us all about yourself.
Well, thank you guys for having me today, and I'm just thrilled to be on this panel with all of you wonderful, talented, and creative folks. My name is Mina Krenic. I reside in Los Angeles, and I work for Perkins & Will. I'm an interior design director there. I consider myself a social scientist. I'm very much immersed into understanding clients' businesses and organizations and really creating spaces that are really purposeful and meaningful in relation to just intentional spaces that have a great deal of brand value and strategy for the folks we're designing for. Perkins & Will is a real humanistic organization where we focused a lot on success metrics and evidence-based design. So it's really much more about an informed space. And I think that's what people are really craving right now, just from where we are with all of what's going on, are many crises in the world right now. So excited to be here and be a part of this conversation.
Great. Well, thank you all again for taking the time out of your busy days. And I know that you're working on some interesting things. Actually, right before we started recording, a few of us were talking about sort of pivoting in COVID times, projects that were sort of midway in different phases of design. And how things have kind of shifted. So I'd actually be curious, maybe we could start talking there. Sasha, you were in particular talking about a multifamily residential project you're working on where things have kind of shifted from one set of priorities maybe to another. If you could just talk a little bit about that, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, sure. We're seeing these sort of mid-COVID pivots going on in a number of sectors in the residential project side. For us, the multi-unit residential projects, we're seeing kind of a shift in priorities where over the last decade or so, it was really about shared amenity spaces in buildings, at the sacrifice of individual unit size, right? So people were really interested in, willing to put up with a much smaller footprint, but in exchange for common area amenities, shared, cooking facilities and entertaining facilities, but basically, extension of their living spaces, and of course, fitness centers and all the, things like that. And now the developers we're working with are kind of taking a look at the market demanding a little bit more personal individual unit space, right? Maybe a little extra space for an office nook or something like that, because people are working from home. And there's really much less interest in indoor shared amenity areas. Roof decks and gardens and so on certainly remain a strong feature, but we're seeing a shift there. And then of course in the workplace side, it's even much more profound than that.
Yeah, Kimberly, you were talking too about some retail projects you're working on, kind of similar. I'm also curious in general if clients are thinking, if the pivot is sort of thought of as the short-term pivot, like, okay, for the next year we're going to do this, but we need to design for the future. Are clients kind of designing, thinking of like kind of two end games, or are they just kind of focused on the near term?
I think in recent it shifted. When this first shelter in place happened, we put together a hacker's guide because we were trying to think, let's just get to September, right? And then we'll see where the world is. But as we're realizing now, it's a total reevaluation of real estate and what it can really do for a company and how it's a resource. And I think as we're in, however many weeks we're into this now, that we're realizing that need of what a workplace can really do for a client and a client's culture and resources that we don't have at home, even with like an office nook or the ability to have a high speed internet at home, there's things that you don't have that you're missing from the office besides just the social aspect and connecting with clients and connecting with your coworkers. I think there's definitely was like, at least for what I've seen for a lot of our clients and even within Blitz, I think there's like this great 2-month period where you're very focused and your productivities go really high. But as it starts to get into month 7, it gets a little wary, right? And then you don't have that same interaction or innovative conversations that are happening ad hoc. So when we think about that, it's not just about doing workplace for our clients that are just packing in desk. It's about really what is that neighborhood? What's the tool? What is that, offsite for a company?
Yeah, it's like cyclical almost too. I find, even in defining my own sort of periods of productivity, I was like exactly that, like productive for this period, and then things kind of went off the rails a little, and I had to sort of rejigger even just like where I was working and how I was working at home. And we're all thinking in these kind of like short little chunks of time, I guess.
Even for parents that their kids are going back to school, so like that changes their game too. Like where they were in July is completely different from the beginning and the start of their school year.
Yeah, and in some cases, right, by the week and by the day, as schedules keep changing. So
yes.
I think what's really interesting is kind of the journey that we've watched from short-term strategy thinkers to long-term strategy thinkers. I think in the very beginning, there was folks thinking about 6-foot distancing, people that didn't even understand what 6 foot was and what that meant, and how they choreographed around the grocery store to avoid people, and actually just really understanding how people we've been seeing different facets of people. I'm so intrigued with the fact that with these Zoom calls, you may see someone's cat running across the screen and you meet their partners, or you see your client without makeup on. So it's become, in one sense, very vulnerably, like you're feeling a different level with your clients and colleagues that you've never felt before, because you feel like you're seeing all facets of their life. And with our clients, I've also seen that too. I think that there's a response of how do we get people initially back to the office. So we're like responding to that. But then there's other organizations that we feel like are thinking long-term strategy. We may not know the answer today, but they're hiring Perkins and Will for future strategies. What can we look for? What is the real meaning of office? HR groups have been investing in really understanding how to make the lifestyle of an employee really work for the business. And I think this is the first time in like workplace design where they've really dived deep into individual people's work styles and curating that actual environment for the future. So, and I love the whole idea of not even thinking about workspace or work, and like really taking the time to say, what are we really designing? You know, what do we really need to be an effective group of people, or people that have a certain mission? So I think that part of it's really been fascinating to kind of watch how we're kind of all evolving month to month, but it also to see how people's mindsets are shifting from short term to long term.
I totally agree with that. I think it's been a really interesting evolution, and this idea of productivity as a measure, right, was this early idea in this cycle, and the idea is really limiting. When we're focusing only on productivity, you know, first of all, you have existing workflows, existing teams who just basically took it all home, right? And then you have the impact of the pandemic itself, where there's not much else to do. There were very few distractions. There was no travel. There were no restaurants open in the beginning. There was nothing to do. And we're in a recession, a major recession, and people are, there are layoffs, and unemployment is extremely high. And so people were fearful of losing their jobs. And so no wonder productivity is up. People leaned into their jobs like they had before. But we're seeing over time now in the cycle that that's not sustainable, right? And we're starting to have conversations about mental well-being and about the effects of isolation and what I call the fidelity loss of the experiences that we're having, right? This virtual interaction, yes, it's great, and there's no one at the head of the table in the Zoom room, and everybody can see each other, and that's all. It's all very. It's an accessible experience, right? But at the same time, it's also a very limiting experience. You don't get to read between the lines of the dynamic of a room and seeing someone's facial expression, in a little bit more detail, or seeing a reaction around a group of people. And so I think we've kind of started to bump up against the limits of this digital-only experience. And in our discussions with clients, we're clearly talking about a hybrid of experiences going forward, where yes, we're going to, this is proven that we can be productive at home, that we can support a distributed workforce, that people can have more autonomy and agency in deciding how they want to work, what their best work mode and location is, and all of that. I think that corporate America has woken up to that in a big way. But the knee-jerk reactions that we've seen of like, well, we're just going to get rid of offices altogether, we'll just be a completely remote or distributed team. I think that's really reactionary and pretty short-sighted. I don't think you can replace person-to-person experience with digital interface, at least not with the tools we have now. It's just not as satisfying.
I think that's something that Jen and I were talking about ahead of this conversation in terms of like all the reactionary behaviors. We saw that. I mentioned a lot of projects, a lot of customers came to us for those solutions. And really early on, we were just quoting lots of the desk screens and lots of partitions. And it was interesting because we realized we had a huge responsibility, really, because when you saw those reactions that Sasha is talking about, it obviously included some really cheap plastic. I mean, there's no way around it. Let's just say it. There was a lot of really cheap plastic out there. And I think that, as consumers, we have a responsibility to the earth. We're already fighting a ginormous battle against single-use plastics. So every time someone came to us, we were saying, okay, yeah, we can give you a clear acrylic, but that's not going to meet your fire code, and I can't do anything with it later. And what I want you to do is send it back to me when you're finished. So if we have all these temporary situations that we have to plan for, I want to sell you our copolyester. I want to sell you that PETG, because when you're finished with it, I can take it back, send it back to the 3 form, right? And so I felt like we had a big responsibility to kind of come out and actually turn down some sales that just didn't feel like the right opportunities for us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I am really heartened to hear that, clients are doing some good long-term thinking, because you're right. I feel like, Jen, that was so much what we heard in the beginning was like, just get me the plastic divider, just get them up. And, in the end, it's interesting, because I'm thinking a lot about, how much the open office has dominated our discussion of late, for better or for worse. And now all of a sudden we're sort of at this 180 where it's like divide. But then again, are we at a 180? And was the trend going to more separation anyway? And then what does the end user want? And then are clients being, nuanced about separation? Or does everyone just want clear screens because they think that's the way to bring people together? Or are they thinking more about layering and transparency? And, and even how does this fit in with the whole mental wellness component of being kind of together, but having your sort of private, safe nook? I mean, it's a very, philosophical period right now, I think.
I think people are looking at the user experience, the experience of their employees in a much more complete way, and considering things like mental wellness and even the whole idea of purpose-built spaces, mission-driven spaces. What is the reason for a workplace to exist in the first place? I think that a lot of the solutions we were seeing as sort of commonplace in the last 10, 15 years, they had evolved out of previous iterations, which had evolved all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it was this sort of production-oriented thinking, and then there were some disruptive concepts, but the whole idea of putting people in cubicles and rows and all of that kind of planning is all based on efficiency, right? And we were trying to put as many people into as little real estate as possible. And I think people are looking at that in a completely new way now, looking at how work really gets done and how people really communicate, and what's best done in a group setting and what's best done in an individual setting, and what are the kind of environments we need to support those kind of activities. And so I think it's a frightening time right now, for sure, from a business standpoint, from a health standpoint, but it's also, I think, one of the most exciting times, certainly in my career, to be at the forefront of designing for clients who are rethinking the use of real estate in a fundamental way, and so yeah, it's kind of a thrill.
I mean, I find it really fascinating about thinking about, like, we're working with a client today. That's why I was a little tardy to this get together, but they were talking about, like, just really removing workstations altogether in their work environment, because they were really seeking spaces for meeting and venuing and lounge environments, and really developing their office like a third space as a secondary space. And I have this conversation with them that, the office really needs to be a destination, because they know a lot of their colleagues in this organization can get their work done at home, that we've done tons of surveys month after month after month. So what would force them or engage them to come back? And so in this exercise, we're talking a lot about outdoor meeting spaces, and really thinking about how can we engage them in a way that makes it quite unique, that I want to come into the office and have coffee with my colleague because this is a unique space, or this is a space where I can retreat to, or it has really great ability to, do edit my, video sweep, or like have a huge room for a multi-use room that can be used for a Zoom call. So, like, advantages of coming into an office has to be really thought about for the business. As Sasha was saying, it really needs to be much more focused than before. Like, I feel like a lot of times people kind of jumped on the bandwagon of what do you need? I need a certain percentage of meeting spaces and workstations. And now it's much more about what does this company need to be a thriving business, and what do the people that work at this company actually need, and how do we feel more connected with the company itself. And I think what's been really also really interesting is with this organization is that they said that their company actually has been stronger, not only as individual offices and cities, but as a collective global company, because they get to have more meetings collectively together that everybody's invited to the table. And so like where they used to have conferences and small groups of people coming together, they're having Zoom calls that affect, that haven't reached to many, right? And you had to influence many. So they feel more connected to the company because of these kind of advancements. So as Sasha was saying too, like I have to see the silver lining as designers and creators and artists is that this is the time to rethink these typologies and really use this as an advantage of helping people in a new profound way with some of the lessons they learned.
Yeah, maybe we're in sort of this recessionary period now, but if we're thinking long term, I just feel like all of this is such a good argument for bringing professional design services to the table because, yeah, clients need these very specific solutions. There is no one size fits all. And I think that organizations seem to be catching onto that more and more, you know, from the conversations I'm having with you all. I mean, how is this playing out differently in, say, you know, retail, hospitality? If someone can maybe sort of speak to that. Again, I'm sort of like coming back to like the idea of the multifamily, like Sasha, like here you are, Mina, on one hand talking about like people retooling their offices for this communal experience. And then Sasha, you know, multifamily, they're doing away with a lot of the amenities that people had been craving. So there is this funny balance between, you know, kind of creating these gathering spaces, but doing it in a way that is responsible. And is it, you know, partitioned differently? Is it laid out differently? I'd love to hear more about that.
And it's also a question, to me, it's a question of the horizon as well. Like how far ahead are we planning for residential product? You know, it's a 3 to 4 year development cycle, and bringing product on the market is it's hard to time, right? Because this is such an unpredictable environment in terms of when we might have a vaccine or we might have widespread rapid testing to make people feel comfortable in those communal spaces again, whether that's in your office or in a retail environment or in a residential, you know, common area. So, you know, I think this is why we've seen, you know, engagements at a strategic, you know, workplace strategy, workplace planning level. But not much in the way of actual project execution at this point. Anyone who's been able to put projects on hold for a while has done that because it is just such an unstable, unpredictable environment, and to make you know, these large real estate decisions, you know, with high cost impact is risky. And so I think we're all taking this time to study the problem. And to reevaluate and to rethink some of the premises we have been using before. And I think that's really healthy. And I think out of this will come a new generation of places, whether they're workplaces or places to live or places to shop. And I think that we'll have some new experiences that are guided by some different principles, maybe a little bit more of a human approach, and focused on experiences rather than just, you know, profit or productivity.
I also think, like, if we're just like dreaming for a minute, I think that like shared spaces could be valuable. So the lobby space of a hotel experience or hospitality experience could be connected to an organization's third space, right? So like this idea of taking advantage of the real estate and actually sharing it in the future, I'm really intrigued with organizations that want to bring the consumer in, like companies that want to invest in bringing their consumer into their work environment. So what if we start really pairing ourselves or partnering with companies that we want to align ourselves with? So I feel like there could be an aspect of taking advantage of a lot of real estate that's being unused, unfortunately, right now, but sharing it so that you bring the community in to these spaces that typically were kind of established for certain uses altogether. So I've just noticed how generally our society has gotten very intrigued with local and supporting their community locally, much more so than they have been before. So what about this opportunity of really localizing some of these spaces so that people feel much more connected on a ground level to what's happening in their city? So I also think people are really fascinated with their neighborhood, right? Like at times at this point, people are walking around their neighborhoods, meeting their neighbors much more so than they've been before, understanding the context of what they're living, because that's been their limit of where they're actually getting out and interacting. And I think there's been such an interesting move, people that are in big cities moving out to the suburbs, because there's a fascination with creating these kind of quaint environments that they feel connected to the community with.
Yeah, interesting to hear, right, the sort of hyper-local, but also like the inclusivity aspect I'm finding fairly heartening, because it just seems to be something we've all been talking about, but it's like, trying to move the needle in the right direction. And now is a really good time to be rethinking a lot of these practices that were maybe not so inclusive previously, and, how that's playing out in different disciplines and spatial types.
I love that, Jen, and I love what Mina said about the community, because I think we've talked a lot about, the pandemic and the economic crisis that we're in, but, we also are seeing a lot of racial disparity, right? So as it pertains to making people feel good in spaces, we have to acknowledge that that kind of falls on architects and designers, on those in the built environment, for those problem-solving skills, right? That struggle for kind of a more equitable society. I think we really have to look at, where is this building, and make sure that it is reflective of the diversity in that community that we're serving, right? And so while we've talked a lot about COVID, as you talk about community and kind of staying low to the ground and really seeing what's going on, I think we have to address that that's going on at the same time, right? Racial disparity is going on at the same time as this pandemic.
I think there's also like a failure in work from home of not recognizing some equity in that not everyone can have the resources to be able to work from home fully. Right. So that's the other reason why the office is still not going to go away, and why it's still really important, because you can't assume that the setup for work from home is the same for everyone.
Right. I remember when we first started working from home, a lot of my reps are already remote, right? They work from home, but a lot of our colleagues here in Salt Lake City that were, home, just we're having a hard time kind of just finding their rhythm, right? And I think we touched on that earlier. When we were at home, so were our kids, right? I remember a meeting with my executive team, and I live in a home that was built in 1935, so there's no lock on the door, right? And so my 6-year-old and my 5-year-old are coming in, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I've got to figure this out, right? And I just put like a little lock on the door and the frame there afterwards. But I still got pelted one day with a water gun that went underneath the door. So I think we all were just like, we had those challenges, and everybody just had different challenges. And now here we're slowly starting to come back. And I think that feels good, because there are some groups like our engineers and our designers who require a lot of collaboration, and that feels best in person, I think. Even sales and marketing, I feel like we like to have a meeting once a week and just collaborate in person. So we're kind of figuring that out as we go still. I think we're talking about a lot of companies that are looking for solutions, but I think there's been a big theme here of kind of like the start and the pause, and the start and the pause, and I think there's still so much unknown.
The idea of equity, I've been thinking, some of these companies really understand that people may not have the right setup, so they're investing $1,500 or $2,000 in stipends for people to get the right task chair and be able to get the right setup for them. So I admire those companies for actually being very cognizant about that and making those efforts, because then it really keeps it a common playing field for all. I also think that even universities have invested in laptops and Wi-Fi for students to make sure, as students are doing distance learning, that they have the right supplies. So I do think there has been some effort, but obviously we need to make sure that it's, increased and everybody is in the same platform. In relation to like design and design thinking, and kind of we're very fortunate to be in the kind of A&D community that we are in, but I have noticed with designers that I feel like in this kind of platform of learning and creating, that I've noticed that some people communicate via chat and some people are actually, drawing on the screen. And in some sense, our kind of collaborative process has become interesting because the introverts are still engaged and the extroverts are even more engaged than they were before. So I do feel like there is some positive things in relation to being in the screen together, because there's no like actual hierarchy in a physical space, because we're all kind of equally positioning ourselves in this call. But just an observation to think about it in relation to equity.
And you're talking about this disparity between people who have, a home setup that's conducive to work and others who might have challenging situations. And those situations may not necessarily be related to physical workspace either, right? They could be caregivers or there's other situations. And so that's one end of the equation. And the other equation is, of course, in the workplace. When we are talking about coming back to the workforce now, we're to the workplace, we're now talking about the idea of presence, right? Whether you're physically present and participating in person, and you're still going to have a portion of the workforce that's going to be digitally connected, and how we treat each other in that disparate environment is going to be really critical. And I think design can play an important role in how we make those interactions meaningful for both the people in the room and the people on the screen, and how we design for those experiences is going to be, important, because that is, just the second a meeting is over, sidebar conversation happens on the way out of the room, and the people who are on the screen, they didn't hear that. And now how do you loop them back in, right? How do we share the information? So part of it's a technology problem. But I think there's also, I think there's a big protocol and human interaction side to it. How do we have more considerate interactions with one another? Mm-hmm. The physical space and how do spaces support that kind of interaction in a better way?
Definitely.
So it's a really complicated problem, I think, and that's going to be the challenge for the next phase as we get past COVID and into a new distributed work model for most companies. That's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah, it shouldn't be punitive that you are working from home when maybe half of the team is working from home and half of the team is actually in the office, right? So how do you set up those protocols and the design to actually support that, right? I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, we're still in this kind of like messy middle where we're figuring out so much, and there's a lot of new problems that present themselves, but a lot of opportunities to be fixing some of the old problems. And I think, like in the immediate term, they're not all going to be solved, but I am really hopeful for the long term, just, how much we're talking about these really important things that make people feel, included in an organization. And I know right now it's like an employer's market, but I just feel like in the not too distant future, the organizations that are going to come out on top are the ones that show that they're taking care of their people somehow and making them feel safe, and not just through like cleaning protocols in the workplace, but, really addressing kind of human beings holistically and understanding what people need and providing these different channels for communication, kind of like meeting people where they're at. I do look forward to, maybe I'm a little overly optimistic, but I feel like that's not so far off in the distant future.
I think that's true, because if it's going back to the company trusting their employees, right? So if there's that trust there, then we all understand that work isn't happening necessarily between 9 to 5, and it's not necessarily happening in one specific space. So it's not this watchdog of, you need to be in the office between these hours so that I can see that you're doing work and you're being productive. That's like the old way of thinking, right? So it's really about, okay, well, this collaborative meeting is happening on site on Wednesday at 2:00. And so we know everyone's there. But for the rest of the time, somebody might be working at 9:00 at night because they're a caretaker between 6 and 8, or whatever your situation is. And then what we're really designing is that support space and functionality for what the company needs and what the use cases are that are specific. And that also can change. That might change in 1 year, it might change to something else in 5 years. It's if we've learned nothing, is that we cannot predict the future, especially in a 6-month increment.
Is like reconfiguration even more important than ever before, or do you find that that's something that people aren't talking about as much? I would just assume that everyone is thinking about like, how can I design this space now so that it could be this in 6 months if needed, or this in a year? Is that something people are talking about?
I feel like we had a lot of clients that didn't know what their growth was going to be in the next 5 years, let alone the next year. So there was always that level of flexibility. But I think we're definitely talking about design in a much more evergreen state so that it can last. Not only because sustainable reasons, we don't want to just keep buying things and throwing them out, or building things and ripping them down, but also it is because there has to be this agility and this flexibility to react, and not just reactionary to like, this is or like we're stuck in this bubble and everything is set up for this one function in this one case scenario, and this is where we are as a company right now, and we're never going to change because companies change and cultures change and the staff evolves and the staff needs evolve. So you have to be able to react to so many different parameters in the design.
And I think that's actually the shift in the conversation that's so exciting right now, that our clients are thinking more about how staff needs might evolve, right? What their employees need to be fully engaged and productive and satisfied in their work. This experience, this COVID experience, this work from home experience, this stressful pressure cooker we've all been in, I think has revealed, right, the importance of the human element in spaces and in design of spaces and in organizations, and the fact that our clients realize, that their greatest asset is their employees, and getting them the support they need to be their best is a complicated puzzle, and the spaces are a huge part of that puzzle, right? What the workspace does, not just in terms of fulfilling physical needs or providing, tools or whatever, but what it conveys about the values of an organization and how it makes people feel connected and engaged, right? The space as an ambassador of culture is I think something that many clients are really thinking about more now, and so all these factors, inclusion, not just racial equity, racial equality, but or social equity, but designing for people on the spectrum, designing for gender neutral experiences, designing all these kinds of components to making people feel comfortable in a workplace, feel fully considered in a workplace. That's the opportunity we have right now, right? And to seize on this unique moment in our lives, in our history, to rethink kind of what spaces can do to amplify those values, and I think that's incredibly exciting.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I've never seen this much empathy and mindfulness being talked about. I mean, organizations are very much about scenario modeling for different work styles and understanding those individual work styles so that people can do their best work. And I find it really interesting as well with like the amount of emotional intelligence that people are using now more so than ever before. And because people's EQs are a little bit higher because they're working on this platform, it kind of opens up their mind to really think about the work differently, think about how they're engaging with people in new ways, and really trying to connect in a deeper way across the screen. I think it's definitely elevated that aspect of it. And as an organization, Perkins & Will, we've spent a lot of times too thinking about rituals, right? Like regardless of being virtual or physical or analog, like how do we create like rituals that people feel like, oh my gosh, I'm a part of this. There's a sense of belonging. And I think, as all of you know, we all crave some sense of belonging to a mission or a purpose. And I think that is going to be, totally rethought when you think about the work environment and people's lifestyles and figuring out new ways how that's going to kind of come together, because I think our society is going to demand that, and the expectation is going to be much higher.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The simple question of like, how do we design spaces so that people feel good in them? It's like, it's so complex because it's all the social emotional side and the sense of community and belonging and the inclusivity. And then, and then there's the actual like materials and spatial partitioning and layouts and color choices. And maybe we can shift a little bit to talking about materials and how you're thinking about them differently in this time period. Is durability more important than ever before, less important? How about cleanability? I feel like there's a lot of conflicting discussion about like needing surfaces to be cleanable, but then durability is important too. And, you know, I've never had so many conversation about like cleaning protocols and who's upholding them and who's writing them and are they appropriate for the spaces, and, you know, how is that playing out? And also even just thinking about texture and the importance of, you know, tactility. We can't just have these like seamless, easy to clean surfaces for the, you know, for the rest of time, or even really for now. So maybe you can all just talk a little bit about how, kind of what you're thinking about in terms of like materials choices.
Definitely don't want it to look overly sanitized and scary. So I think that's a really good point about texture, tactility, and understanding like emotional reactions to things. There's definitely an emphasis on things that can be used or changed out or used in more than one way. Like, if we are putting a divider up, is it also writable that can then be reconfigured when desks aren't 6 foot apart? And thinking about really simple terms in that way. There's definitely a lot of furniture vendors that are coming out with a lot of interesting solutions, and other manufacturers that are coming out with some interesting solutions that have definitely piqued my interest. And also just like leaning on some of the resources that buildings in place have, right? I think it was talking about like community, about do you have to build everything in the campus, or is there actually resources that are in the neighborhood that can be used as part of the programming? So you're not building this whole thing there.
Yeah, those are great points. And I what you were saying initially there about the you know, the appearance of you know, cleanability or cleanliness, or, I mean, part of this is really, it's an emotional experience, right, for the end user. It's not just about being clean or you know, being non-conducive to virus spread or to germs or whatever. It's about how it makes people feel, how it looks. You know, if it looks overly sanitized or overly you know, like a seamless, shiny, cleanable surface everywhere, then you're going to feel like that's a very sterile environment, and that's not very comforting either. And I think that right now, in the short term, the sensitivity is towards, you know, porous surfaces or textured surfaces or fabrics and textiles and so on that people are fearful about that, right? But you know, people have short memories, and once we have a vaccine and testing and so on, and the idea of a virus lingering on surfaces is not going to be as on the forefront of everyone's mind as much, right? So I think then that emotional response is going to shift again to how places make you feel, and conveying safety can happen in a number of different ways. And right now we're in this reactionary mode, and a lot of it's really crude, right? People are replacing porous surfaces with, you know, smooth reflective surfaces or whatever, and people are putting, you know, signage everywhere, and it just feels like a highly controlled, and, you know, the screens Jen was talking about, that's all like a very immediate triage kind of response. It's very reactionary, and I think that now we're in a phase where we're starting to look a little bit more long term about how can we incorporate some of these concepts and not have it be so reactionary, but have it be integrated and purposeful and a little bit more elegant, and you know, convey that kind of sense of safety. Joy.
Can we just have some joy?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I guess the other thing that's really been really interesting to watch is how quickly some of these touchless elements have become part of mainstream society, right? And I think that part's a little bit exciting because, you know, 2 years ago, I worked on a project for Unilever in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. And in that project, we had 15,000 sensors in the building. So how does a building take care of the user, right? And I think that's kind of an interesting component where, you know, the building is kind of informing you of when the building was last cleaned or when something was filtered or something like that. So there is an aspect of technology integration that's seamless. Just like, you know, Google, Alexa here with me in the room, I get information from her. There's like this idea that things are voice activated. Can you please start my Teams meeting? There's a way that I feel like these more engagements with touchless voice activation and using sensor technology to provide psychological safety for the user. I think that's the part that kind of gets me all jammed up, because I'm like, okay, this is the stuff that could really be meaningful for the user, where you don't have, how many things do you have to touch before you get into a space, right? But if things are voice activated and things are much more seamless, then you feel like, oh, this building is actually taking care of me, right? And I think that's the idea people are feeling so nervous about with ventilation in conditioned spaces right now.
Yeah.
There's this great benefit of the technology too, where it actually helps inclusivity, right? Where if you're doing voice activation or you're doing automated door swings, then all of a sudden things are becoming barrier free in the same way, which is a great pro to all that.
I think, Jen, in regards to your conversation about, materials out there, I was nervous that sustainability was just going to be thrown out the window, right? And that wasn't going to either be considered by the end user, or so many designers, even if their customer doesn't want it, it's just part of their standard practices. But I've really been excited that beyond being able to reuse or reconfigure the material, people are still really concerned about low emitting materials. And, when we talk about trying to get people to move from that a clear acrylic over to our PETG, yes, it is Green Guard certified. And right now people are still concerned about indoor air quality, right? And I think they're also interested in just, well building certifications and the Living Building Challenge. And so I feel inspired that part of materiality and that part of the manufacturer's responsibility is still part of conversations.
Yeah, that is super exciting. And you're right. I think this whole emphasis, I feel like in the beginning we were talking about surface, and then it's been much more about thinking about ventilation in terms of mitigating the virus. And that has really brought even more attention to just air quality in general. I also think, something like technology, these touchless technologies indeed are so interesting. And then the flip side, I'm really hearing a lot more about people tapping into principles of biophilia to create, safer environments, or, kind of tapping in the sense of psychological comfort and safety. And that seems to be something that's gained even more traction recently, or I hope it has, because that's certainly something that can just bring so much to the end user.
Well, and I think that goes back to that importance of place and those feelings that everyone on this panel has touched on, right? Biophilia kind of got this resurgence, if you will, because we started talking about how does it make someone feel? What impact does it have on their health? And I think, at first with some of our clients, they were like, oh, well, if we're just trying to bring a little bit of green into the space and we're trying to look at translucency, 3-form answers both of those, right? But it really was bigger than that. It was more about just how it makes someone feel when they're in the presence of that material. And I quickly realized in helping architects find those solutions was that it wasn't just about the obvious, plants, and it wasn't about graphics of plants, right? That it was more organic than that. And, we were quickly pivoting to all right, well, what about, let's do a graphic image that's somewhat, organic. So if I'm sitting at an infusion center and I'm looking at something organic, maybe I draw different inspiration from that graphic image, right? And so I know it feels like that biophilia is really relevant again, but I think it all goes back to making people feel good in that space.
Putting the feelings in biophilia, I guess. I know we're getting down, clock is ticking, we're down to the last 2 minutes. I would love if there's any questions, burning questions that any of you have for your esteemed colleagues here. If there's just I'm always curious, what is the question that's sort of burning at your brain always? What things, what question are you always trying to answer these days? Is there something that's kind of pressing for you? And it can be a high concept question, or it can be something very much about the practicalities of design. Let us into your brains.
You know, the question that I get asked all the time from our sales reps is really, how is our collaboration with our clients going to need to change, right? And I'd love to hear from these guys, because I certainly think that in some areas, you know, lunch and learns will probably not exist for a long time. When, you know, like, again, going back to we're meeting people wherever they want, right? Like, one of my reps in Virginia was literally outside her furniture dealer's door with a table and some products, right? And just in their parking lot. And so we're seeing a lot of that. But I just think, you know, what's some insights on how this will be impacted long-term in terms of our collaborations?
Well, I always think our A&D community is so small and so tight, you know, and I think a lot about how our designers work is that they text each other, they text our reps, and, you know, they meet somehow. And the last 7 months, we've had those trunk shows, Jen, that you've been talking about, where we're in somebody's apartment complex and we're with a carpet rep, and we're like looking at carpet for a client that we're going to go and engage with. So I just love it that our reps in our A&D community will do anything for us. I mean, it's such a great family. And, you know, I feel like, you know, we're used to a library and an office, but I think at the end of the day, all of the relationship build that we've done across the country and with our local community, I think is really powerful now. The fact that we can text our reps and get information sent directly to our home, I think all of that is just a testament of how beautiful our kind of interactions are. And I have to say that, you know, I've only been in this industry, but I do really love how all of our reps are our friends, right? And that's because of people like you that have really invested in those relationships, right? So I am very super thankful for that. But I mean, I don't know, I do a lot of happy hours too with our teams, because I bring them into our kind of every weekly meetings so that they're a part of our family, they're our partners and projects. And so I think it's just that, once again, it comes down to relationships for me, and they can happen virtually. Yes, I love those dinners, and I love spending time, you know, playing with my colleagues. And I think, you know, walking meetings have been a really great things for our team. But I think if the relationship's there, we'll find a way to make the connection.
Perfect answer.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I feel like this world has really opened up. I mean, I feel like we all were kind of like locked into sort of like a few different ways of connecting. And now, you know, the world's our oyster. You're right. You can sit on the sidewalk, you can go for a walk, you can Zoom. I mean, even Zoom, like I did a little bit before COVID, but now it just is so much more viable if you do need to connect with somebody and you can't get there. It's exciting that that is something we can all do now. But I love ending on this like collaborative, feel good, like pro industry note. It really is, we really do have a special and unique industry, I think. Really appreciate you all being here, taking the time to talk about, you know, all things kind of process, practical products, you know, conceptual topics as well. We really covered a lot of ground, and we're so grateful, Jen, you and 3Form for making this happen. It's just so wonderful to have the opportunities to sort of pull together and just have these nice high-level conversations and just, you know, check in with each other and hear what everybody is doing. So thank you.
For sure. No problem. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Be creative.